From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. Sato Moughalian and Ryan Nazari, thank you so much for joining me today. Sato, you're a doctoral student in history at CUNY Graduate Center, and this is your second career. Previously, you were a professional classical touring flutist.
Yes.
And Ryan, you are also a doctoral student in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies here at Columbia, and you are studying specifically
the Armenian language in Iran, plus some other stuff as well. So
great. Yeah, and we're here to talk about the Armenian language and your experiences with studying it, why you've come to study this language, and what you've learned in studying it here at Columbia with Professor Karmanoukian.
Thank you for having us too.
Yeah,
this
thank
is
you.
amazing. Very exciting.
My pleasure. So I'd like to start by just asking about Armenian in general. Now, I know there's a particular situation with this language, that there are different standards and dialects. So could you explain to me what these different standards are, how they interplay with each other, and what that means for speakers of Armenian today?
Yeah, Armenians have always been spread across this high tableland in Eastern Anatolia into the South Caucasus. And because people in general were not very mobile in those days, dialects developed in each region that were quite distinct. But of course, Armenians started patterns of dispersion, more than 1,000 years ago, through violence of various rulers or by being deputized to rule on behalf of certain rulers. And so what happened was a large population sort of grew in the region of Constantinople, which was the kind of became the home of the Western, generally speaking, kind of Armenian, and then around Tbilisi today, which was the cultural capital for Armenians in the South Caucasus, you had the Eastern standard that developed. But this is a very complicated story over time, because not only do you have all these separate dialects, you have the introduction of written Armenian, beginning of the 5th century, as Armenians Christianized and wanted to have their own written language for the Bible and for various other types of books, religious tracts, and then eventually grammars and dictionaries over time. So, but this had a much more kind of abrupt separation during the First World War, during the Armenian genocide, when the vast majority of the Ottoman Armenian population was either massacred or forcibly expelled. And so those were the people who had kept the tradition of Western Armenian, what we call Western Armenian today. And so today it's considered a definitely endangered language by UNESCO. Many of the people who preserved it, carried it on for generations, died. And so there are a lot of efforts by AGBU, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, and other organizations to support the teaching of Western Armenian to keep this language alive. And indeed, a lot of people are beginning to learn it, like us.
Yeah.
And Columbia has this wonderful professor who teaches both Eastern and Western Armenian.
So just to kind of recap so that I understand it, it seems like the language really coalesced around two poles historically.
Yes.
And so you had this, really seems like going back 1,000 or more years, this situation where you have this kind of doubling or double situation for this language.
Yeah, you explained it much more clearly than I did. Thank you.
We got the nice historical, all that background. But it's also, those are the two main ones, but then they come in contact with different ways. Like if you go to Glendale, you'll hear both. There's some books. There's one book, I forget the name, but it was written as someone writing a letter in Eastern Armenian, and then the response was in Western Armenian.
Wow.
So do both Western and Eastern Armenian use the same script, or are they different scripts?
It's basically the same alphabet.
Okay.
I mean, most of it is the same letters, but they're used differently, and then there's some like cluster letters that are more typically used in Eastern Armenian than Western Armenian.
Sure. So how similar are these languages? If you know one, can you easily learn the other, or is it really hard? How would you?
Why don't we give you a demonstration?
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay,
Love
I'll
this.
just say Anunis Satoy.
And I can say Imanuna Rayane or just Anunis Rayane. So,
Okay, well, I could say Imanunis Satoy.
yeah. But like there, for example, I think in Western you have to say Imanunis.
You don't have to
You
say
don't?
no.
Okay.
Because the possessive or the party of the speaker or the party of the object is contained within the word itself.
Yeah, and then I mean, there's like
It's inflected. Yeah.
Yeah, but then it gets more complicated with like the sound, the pronunciation,
And the
then,
conjugations.
Yeah, the conjugation, the grammar.
Oh, should we just say "How are you" or something
yeah,
like that?
the
Easy.
bonces.
Inchbeses.
Yeah, I mean, like we would say inchbeses too, but it's also like it's, sometimes it gets more complicated. Like the sounds are very different. Like Badev is a clear one.
Padev,
Yeah,
yeah.
Padev, the PB difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like a sympathetic speaker could maybe understand the other
Absolutely.
person. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you speak it well, if you know it well, you can absolutely be understood by a speaker of the other standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not so distant that really intelligibility becomes a major
They're
problem.
completely mutually intelligible.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, it just becomes hard when you're like kind of learning it from scratch. Then it's like as all language learning, it's just harder to get to that level. So.
And it's also a challenge, I mean, for me as a Western Armenian speaker, that there are very, very, very few places in the world where Western Armenian is spoken. In fact, Beirut, Burj Hamid, neighborhood of Beirut, is one of the few places where, the language is endemic. And I had hoped to go there this semester to do some of my orals preparation while, listening. But of course, it wasn't possible. And so the challenge of like learning a language where you can't immerse yourself in the environment of that language is kind of doubled.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I was just in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and you really learn so much from the environment, from the people around you. You echo what they say.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I guess that's really a challenge for Western Armenian.
It is, because I might learn a word in 1 year and then not use that word or encounter that word for a year and then encounter it and have to remember. So this is constant like process of like scraping my memory for words. But I'm actually really excited that I'm going to be living in Armenia starting in September for 9 months to do my dissertation research. And I'm going to throw myself into learning Eastern Armenian while continuing to study Western Armenian.
So is Western Armenian then primarily like a diaspora language, or are there places where it is spoken with a significant number of people? How would you characterize
I would
that?
definitely say it's a diaspora language. That's a really good way of putting it. There, as I was saying, there are a few places where you can go. I mean, for example, I was in Canada in May, and I found myself in the company of Western Armenian speakers, which was wonderful. But there were enough. They found each other. They formed social organizations, and they're maintaining the language that way. In Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, a lot of Syrian refugees moved there. And so now you have pockets of Western Armenian, and you have pockets of Western Armenian cuisine and other traditions. So I think also a lot of university students, people are learning Western Armenian to sort of explore another part of their own Armenian heritage. But it is endangered. I mean, there aren't that many speakers.
Sure. What's it like then to take Armenian from a teacher who I guess is a speaker of Western Armenian, sort of natively, but then is trying to handle both Eastern and Western? What's that like?
It's good for me to hear and learn from the other dialect, because I think more of like an ethical, I guess, responsibility. Because like Sato was saying, it's not as easy to learn that language. It's kind of an opportunity. And I think learning it, it's not like, personally, it's not, I see it as a very a good opportunity to have both of those at my disposal. Our professor does a good job of like splitting it up, and when it has to get to some differences, like when we get to grammar, like in our grammar quiz today, like when we had to go through review, I was just a particular question for me, and then she addressed it particularly to me. But one thing I'll add is like I think this is just the state of learning Armenian, because I think it's like when you study Armenian, I don't think you'll really ever have one person who only wants to study Eastern Armenian and one doing Western, because of the diaspora. Like, the world is just getting more connected. So like, it just makes sense that you have to study both, or you have students at least who are interested in both.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And, I mean, of course, with every language, history is completely intertwined. In our language, history is completely intertwined, but sometimes in very funny ways. Like, I was born in Egypt. My family fled when I was a baby. I grew up in the United States, so I'm like a generation 1.5, I guess you call it. My grandparents were born at, the end of the Ottoman Empire. They were deported during the genocide, ended up in Syria, ended up in Jerusalem, where my grandfather recreated the ceramics tradition he had learned in the Ottoman Empire, in Ottoman Kütahya. And then the family stayed there. My mother was born in Jerusalem, fled in 1947 as a young person, moved to Damascus, then moved to Egypt, then moved to New Jersey with me, the baby. And I grew up with certain words. Like, for example, I learned that the word for eggplant was patlıcan. But patlıcan is actually Turkish. And a lot of Armenians, the word in Western Armenian is simpug, So there have been times when I've said, like in a class setting, patlıcan shadgasiram, whatever, I really like eggplant. And they were like, don't you say that.
Oh, wow.
But because these words are embedded, and over time, like repeatedly, Armenians have tried to sort of take out loan words, but it's an impossible task. And the loan words also, I find as a member of the diaspora, loan words also connect you back to where your ancestors lived and thrived. And, your family wouldn't have been what they are if they hadn't lived in those places. So I actually love the loan words.
Yeah.
In Soviet times, there was a lot of excising, but there was also a lot of excising in the 17th, 18th centuries, as Armenian was like standardized by Armenian Catholic congregation of the Mukhitarist Brotherhood, who were actually largely responsible for a huge printing program of Armenian literature and building of schools and printing presses. So there have been repeatedly, among this very big diaspora of Armenians, not so much numerically big, but spread out over space, there have been repeated efforts to, quote unquote, purify the language and produce something that people call makur hayeren, clean Armenian, which we laugh when we hear.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible.
It's
impossible.
Even it's like things like sometimes even just the formation of, like when you form a sentence, like you for example, like if you want to say it's this or that, like it can be both. You can say like ham this, ham that. Ham is also used in Persian for ham, which is and they use the same structure. Like if you want to say, like I want both, and same with Turkish actually. You can say ham, whatever language pronunciation. This, ham that, and like even there's so many other examples.
We say gam.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Or that. It's just So you always have that connection. It's impossible to separate. You just can't.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like every person who comes to this Armenian class, is coming with a kind of crystallization of these different overlaying historical facts, the fragments of empire, genocide, dispersion, and you have to accept all comers, and each person kind of charts their own path through this language learning journey. And as a teacher, you have to do differentiated instruction. Each person kind of needs to get a slightly different set of feedback from the teacher due to these historical events.
Yes, and also due to the dearth of materials that are available. I mean, there's now more material available in Western Armenian, and our professor has pointed us towards certain like Instagram content creators who speak Western Armenian. And so I have now adjusted my whole Instagram feed so that it's only Western Armenian.
Oh, okay.
For Ryan, I guess, you can watch movies in Eastern Armenian like much more easily.
Yeah, and you can obviously travel to like a nation state where it's the national language, and like read a lot of books in it. So
Have you traveled to Armenia?
Yeah, I've been there. I've lived there twice, and that's kind of how I got started learning it. Because I think differently for me, like a lot of one reason people come in with all these different fluencies is because of like being a heritage speaker. I'm not a heritage speaker, and I do have some Armenian roots, but I grew up in an Assyrian language, which is also, I think, important, which maybe I can talk about later. But I learned Armenian kind of not saying like, oh, I'm Armenian, that's kind of a duty. It was more so like, I come from this Assyrian household. Assyrians and Armenians have lived side by side in different villages and cities. And it's like almost like there's some solidarity because it's similar experiences. Like Assyrian language is extremely, I don't know how it's classified in UNESCO, but it's also an endangered language and everything. So that's how I came into it. I was living in Armenia to teach English. Then I did some research there a couple years later, and then now I'm here. So
sure.
Yeah.
Well, Sato, you've already kind of previewed this, but let me ask you, Ryan, about your own specific path to taking Armenian. And can you talk about the language or languages that you spoke growing up, and and then what led you to engage with Armenian?
Yeah, so I grew up speaking Assyrian.
And can you elaborate on?
Of course.
Yeah.
It's like a Semitic language similar to Hebrew, Arabic, but so many different dialects. So I grew up speaking this northern Iranian dialect, and then English, of course. And I came to Armenia to teach translators English, and that's when I really understood how amazing language learning is, and how it's like also a part of so much. Like in California, it's Spanish, so many different languages. My family, they're Iranian. They all speak Persian, English, Assyrian. My grandmother spoke Armenian because her neighbor was Armenian. Like what we were talking about, it's impossible to really separate all these languages from each other. So part of it is for research because I want to like learn about Armenian literature in Iran. But also part of it is just because I think learning languages is just so important. Teaching translators taught me that.
Sure.
And Armenian in particular, I just think is very beautiful. So even if I wasn't doing it for research, I just want to do it, just to be able to speak and drink tea and gossip and whatever it is, whatever you need to do. Yeah.
Was it hard to learn Armenian for you?
It's really, I think, because I learned it by speaking it in the streets. So I think for me, it's easier to just say things like where are we going? Because I go in a taxi and we say that. For me, it's harder though, because I think it's like I know some things, like the word for like getting in a car or whatever, but I don't know the word for like strawberry. It's like it's hard for me to really figure out my fluency. I think it's also hard because I'm like learning different languages for classes and I always mix them up and stuff. Yeah. So it's just my brain, even today, like I said heto instead of het for with like basic mistakes. So it's just harder in that regard.
But what other languages are you learning?
I'm learning Persian, Turkish, Assyrian right now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yes. You can probably tell me because you're, the Language Resource Center. I don't know if that's, but doctors would listen to this say your brain cannot possibly do that, but I don't know. But I think it's a good thing. I think you're supposed to make mistakes and keep growing. My friend told me he tried learning Armenian like 4 times before he finally got into it. It's just it just takes time. It just takes time. Yeah. It's what it is. Like with Western Armenian, for example, you can't just do an intensive course and just everything's fine. You got to take time. You can make mistakes. You might lose some fluency. 5 years later, you might recover it. So
sure. Yeah. And then Sato, you talked about your family history to some extent, but when you were growing up, how much did you speak Armenian or speak parts of it, and how much have you had to learn on your own?
So my parents were both pretty traumatized by the time they got to the United States, and they absolutely just wanted me to be as American as possible, meaning monolingual.
Yeah.
And they only spoke Armenian when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. But of course, kids pick up these things. So I did not learn Armenian as a child. We didn't live close to an Armenian church or Armenian community. I studied French in school. My father was a complete Francophile. He went to French Jesuit schools in Alexandria. And so when I started getting interested in the history of my family, I, of course, had the need to deal with Armenian documents. And I kind of embarked on this 10-year-long project of understanding this ceramics tradition that my grandfather had brought to Jerusalem. And I did my undergraduate studies here at Barnard and Columbia. I majored in music here, and which meant taking a lot of music history courses. So I had some familiarity with like archival work and all of that. And so I started slowly visiting archives and collecting documents because I knew that there were major gaps in the understanding of this art that had migrated from Ottoman Anatolia to British Mandate Jerusalem. And I wanted to understand how and why, which necessitated, spending time with Armenian documents. At the beginning, this is like 2011, 12, 13, I used a translator, and then pretty quickly I thought, I need to do better. I mean, I can't do this like this. So I started taking classes online. They weren't like very rigorous, but I learned to read the alphabet. And then just, TLDR, COVID came, I switched careers. I became a full-time history student because all our concerts had been canceled. And I got a master's degree at the Graduate Center studying basically Armenian cultural production from the end of the imperial era into the early Soviet era, which is still my period. And then as concerts came back, I realized that I didn't want to stop.
Sure.
So I entered the doctoral program there. And then with the consortium that we have, I was able to start actually taking proper Armenian classes here at Columbia. So that has been an immense, immense boon for me.
Right, the Inter-University Doctoral Consortium.
Exactly.
Which connects different New York City universities.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like you have this feeling of repairing a kind of historical rupture.
Exactly. And in fact, I published a book in 2019 called Feast of Ashes, The Life and Art of David Ohanessian. It was Stanford University Press. It was, the result of all that research in narrative form. And I started thinking about for a long, long time, Armenians have necessarily been focused on getting genocide recognition because the successor to the perpetrator state denied it. And, it was suppressed, and there was also no language the word genocide was not coined until the early 1940s by Raphael Lemkin. So, there were many different names, and in fact, there's scholarship now on language that people have used to describe episodes of mass violence because, it's like snow. I mean, do you know what snow is without having a word for it? And in cultures where there's a lot of snow, there are also a lot of words for snow.
Yeah.
But for Armenians and for many other groups, I suspect, who live through mass violence, who survive mass violence, who lose family members, who live with this kind of trauma. I mean, not actually having a word, a single word, but many words, the great catastrophe, the great crime, there were these kinds of words to describe the massacres. I mean, the massacres is a word that was used a lot.
In Assyrian, there's a book about this called The Sword, Saipho.
Yeah, and I mean, Assyrians were also genocided. And then, as you know, of course, there was this huge population transfer between Turkey and Greece. In the early 1920s, where just hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly moved, from one place to the other. So there's a tremendous amount of rupture in the collapse of empires, and a tremendous amount of violence in ethnic homogenization. Language suffers from this, but language is also enriched by it. So I was interested, not only in that because that was the history of my family. But I was interested in Armenian like art production, craft production. I mean, Armenians lived among larger societies, among larger empires, and became renowned for their skills in silk brocade making, in bookbinding, jeweled, crafts, book printing, lots of different things, and prospered as a result of the knowledge that they created in these fields. So they also like carried that knowledge with them, so if they were displaced, it didn't mean that they had lost every chance of a livelihood. And I was interested to see how this played out in a much more modern context. I mean, with the example of my grandfather in mind, who had been a ceramics master at the end of the Ottoman Empire and who reestablished this art in a totally different political setting. So that's kind of what I'm looking at now, is like the role of artists and ethnographers, writers in the transition from the end of empire into the early Soviet state.
I think you make a really good point about labels generally. When it comes to art, traditions, ceramics even, how do we think about these? We say this is, these are, Dutch paintings or Italian or Venetian, glass. Like you categorize these things. And so if the category changes, it can be very difficult to sort of figure out where this belongs, but it certainly does belong somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially when you have a people who are already, who've already been devastated by, huge population losses. Every surviving family has lost family members, so they're dealing with the trauma of trying to reconstruct their lives and the trauma of governments refusing to acknowledge it. I mean, the United States even didn't acknowledge the Armenian genocide until 2021.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of sort of psychic attention was cast on that question. How can we get the world to like recognize this? And there are other things that need to be attended to as well. So
sure.
I'm interested in that, of course, but I'm also interested in the other things. I'm interested in the continuities as well as the ruptures.
Well, I think this kind of points to a dynamic that I've observed in a lot of the languages that we have here at the Language Resource Center, which is, there are a lot of heritage languages that we teach here. And one risk in a heritage language is that sometimes it can become fossilized. What people think about that language, that heritage identity is sort of a remnant of the past. I think that you certainly don't see it that way, Ryan and Sato. I think that you have emphasized many of the living elements of this culture in your book and also in what you're studying now. And so I guess a question that I have for the both of you is, what is Armenian-ness, to use your word? What is Armenian-ness today?
You want to go first?
Yeah, so Sato and I were pointing at each other like, this is an excellent question.
Yeah, very thought-provoking.
Yeah. I just think seeing it in conversation with all these different things, not just with languages, but like whenever I think of that word, I think of my time like being in Lake Sivan and just jumping in the water. It was very cold. I don't recommend it. It just, maybe it's something that language, because I'm just thinking of images when I think of that word, like thinking of all the beautiful memories that I've had with the Armenian language and the people. But that's all I'll say for now. Maybe Sato, you have a more.
Well, I can build a little bit on what you're saying. Can I introduce some of my history, which speaks to this question? So as I was growing up, as I was saying earlier, I didn't speak Armenian, but I had this tremendous sense of being Armenian. I was surrounded in our home with like Armenian things, Armenian ceramics, Armenian embroideries, Armenian carpets. We had relatives in Soviet Armenia who like sent us records of, Khachaturian and whatever. And so pretty quickly, like, because I didn't have words to express a feeling of Armenian-ness, I started playing Armenian music. And there's a lineage in our family. Our grandfather, learned this ceramics tradition in Kütahya in Western Anatolia, which is also where the Armenian composer Gomidas was born. And
he's a great guy. You should listen to him.
Okay.
he's been, he was a priest, a musicologist, educated in Etchmiadzin in Berlin, and he basically functioned as a proto-ethnomusicologist and did a lot of field work notating folk songs, notated thousands of folk songs, still many of which were lost, but he ended up preserving this corpus of Armenian folk music from that whole region. And he was one of the people who was rounded up in Constantinople, arrested, and sent to the interior of the country, where he saw most of there's no exact number, 240, 250 other elites, Armenian elites, who were also sent there, were killed or died of disease. This was like the first public blow. And so he's become this figure that's really like enshrined in Armenian memory. And so a lot of people who don't like know any words of Armenian know the music of Gomidas. I mean, music has turned out to be this very, very powerful vehicle for the expression of Armenian-ness among people. And so, I was playing Armenian music, and it took a while for it to like break through to wanting to learn Armenian words. And so it's the writing the book and doing the research for the book and being among Armenians and like just feeling this tremendous sense of wanting to know the language, the language that I grew up hearing, in the other room or whatever. I mean, there are, of course, all these theories of nationalism, and, an early one, Herder, was that, language is expressed through culture, through language, through traditions, practices, all of this. And for, whatever toppling of his theories of nationalism have occurred since then, I mean, basically, language, music, art, cooking, material culture, like architectural practices, like all of these things are expressions of Armenian-ness, which people exercise to different degrees. So I started out with one, devoted my life to music, always introduced Armenian repertoire on European classical concert programs, tried to talk about the composer. And now in this second, part of my life, I'm in graduate school getting a doctorate in history so that I can continue to research these questions a little bit more methodically.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think the different forms, that's one thing I wanted to add, is the different forms. Like, I don't know if memory is a form, but like I was saying, I just have so many different feelings and memories when it comes to mine. And it's not the stereotypical like, oh, pomegranate, but also just like I went to this Armenian church in California, and there was a food festival, and then my mom ran into one of her old friends, and I just thought of that experience. And it's, the music, it's the poetry, it's the art. I think it's also like, I think Armenian-ness can easily be like, I guess, manipulated. I don't know if that's the word, but like people trying to say something it is, and that can be a bit dangerous, because I think it's kind of, I always think about what it's not, and like sometimes, because I think it can get easy to think like, oh, this is Armenian. It's like, oh, Armenian is, going there in the summers with your family. Armenian is like being from like the places you think of, like this one particular village in Iran or something. Or like I met an Armenian from Las Vegas, and the first instinct you might have is, wait, Las Vegas? There are, Armenians there. So it's always good to just challenge.
Highest?
Yes, highest, exactly.
Are you Armenian?
Yeah. So it's always good.
It's like the big question when you meet somebody, highest?
Yeah,
highest?
Exactly. So it's just good to always just kind of question, like pinpoint what an Armenian-ness is, or like what an Armenian experience is, I think it can be damaging, especially for every human, of course, but I think especially for Armenians that, there's a diaspora, they come from, before the nation state. Even in the nation state, there are some, obviously, Assyrians and other groups, Yazidis, but outside the nation state, it's just, Turkey, Lebanon, et cetera, now in the US, now intermarriages with Irish or whatever it may be. So
You've laid out a very nuanced picture that I think helps to explain why the question, what is Armenian-ness today is a fraught and complex question. But I think one theme that I'm taking from this conversation is that music is definitely a big piece of it. And so maybe we can close by talking about music briefly. This episode opens and closes with music, and music that you, Sato, have recorded. Can you tell us about this music?
Yeah. So in 2015, I wanted to do something to celebrate. I mean, I'm saying celebrate. That's not the right word. Commemorate, but yes, also celebrate, because, while we are commemorating and mourning so much destruction and loss, we're also celebrating endurance and survival. And so I wanted to do something to mark that. And so a friend of mine, Alyssa Reit, a harpist with whom I've been performing Armenian music for a very long time, we decided that we would, record a number of pieces. We would arrange and record a number of pieces, mostly by Gomidas, to honor my grandfather's connection to him, and also because he's such a revered figure in Armenian culture all over the world. But there were some other composers there as well. Ara Dinkjan allowed us, an incredible musician, oud player, allowed us to arrange and record one of his pieces. And then Ronald Suni, the great historian, the Sovietologist, as they used to call him, and Russianist. His grandfather is also, was a musicologist, a contemporary of Gomidas, who didn't achieve the same kind of recognition, but also is a marvelous figure who should be remembered. Grigor Mirsoyan Suni was his name. And so I had asked Ron Suni if we could arrange one of his grandfather's pieces, and he was delighted to help us to do that. So, there's a mixture of things. There's Sayat Nova, there's some Sayat Nova. I mean, it's not really clear if Sayat Nova actually wrote this music. I mean, it's attributed to him. There's a lot of murkiness also in history, and, a lot of these things are taken over by tradition, so to speak, or myth. But we produced a CD, and inside it, a friend of mine, Kevork Murad, a wonderful Syrian-Armenian artist, in calligraphy reproduced an inscription and a funerary mosaic floor that had been rediscovered at the end of the 19th century in Jerusalem, which had been created in the Byzantine era, the 5th or 6th century. And the inscription said something like, "For the souls of all the Armenians whose name only the Lord knows." So already, you have 1,500 years ago, the same kind of like mourning over loss, of dispersal, violence. These are like recurring themes. And that too is part of Armenian-ness, and the need to remember, the need to memorialize, the need to create, I think is like at the heart of being and feeling Armenian. So we wanted to make a contribution to that.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your music. Let me briefly say that anybody who wants to take Armenian, who's a Columbia student or a student in one of the universities with which Columbia has a consortial relationship, is encouraged to check out the Armenian program. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So thank you both for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.